Time we get to hear this message of mystery, right? Have we got you all mysteriously excited about this? So I'm going to ask that you quietly welcome Dr. Dean Shrock.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Christine and Mark and Jeff and everybody for the special song about mystery. And Catherine, invariably sounds like you say something that is a nice segue into what I want to talk about today. So mystery, that's the theme for this month. And I wrote by definition, mystery is unexplainable, unknowable, ineffable, one of my very favorite words. And also transcendent, which was interesting when I was looking up and trying to get a real definition of mystery. And so it also includes the metaphysical, spiritual, and intuitive, not the physical or empirical. And so very commonly for me, as I think about a subject and research it, I found myself asking myself a lot of questions which seemed very appropriate for the title of the talk today on mystery. And one of the first memories I had that I thought I would mention as I considered mystery is remembering, now I'm digressing for a moment, I want to say how fun you are and how much, and how enjoyable it is to go to church. Because as I'm reflecting on one little story I'm going to tell you today, is I remember just trying to make sense of things. And when you're younger, I don't know if you're just naturally curious or confused. Well, a little baby just was killed and burned to death in a car accident. So I went to the minister in my confusion, and how do you explain this? So we talked about the suffering of some people. And it's been a major question for me, even in my professional life, as a psychologist trying to help people and deal with suffering. So if there's an all-knowing, all-loving God, and I'm thinking for myself, I'm asking this minister, what's wrong with this picture? So that was good for me to start thinking about then again of the idea of mystery and how does it all make sense, or does it? Actually, I'm going to digress for another moment. Another thought I just remembered was when I was a freshman in college, I wrote a paper titled Religion is a Crutch. Well, again, just lots of thoughts I've had and ideas trying to make sense of things throughout my life. Anyhow, so the minister just said, God works in mysterious ways. And I just thought, what a cop-out. Forgive me, but I'm admitting that didn't work for me. And I don't know if it's just my inquiring mind or even I'll admit to a sense of not wanting to admit a loss of control over life, that you can't figure some things out. You just have to accept them. Part of your song again today. Maybe it's just we have to accept what is. And I would tell you now I'm older, I think there's great wisdom in that, because the real logic for me is, and I've asked you this before, if you were to think of any subject whatsoever that you think you know a lot about, when will the day come you'll know everything there is to know about that subject? Not going to happen. So again, the clear logic is there's no way you will ever have it figured out, or, forgive me when I say, if you think you do, you're in trouble. So, when I worked in a rehab hospital early in my career, I think that's what really made me start to think about suffering in particular. So I was young enough and naive enough to think that my job was largely to fix you. So what I quickly discovered was, because most of the people were dealing with and recovering from strokes, getting treated for a stroke, was that just one day you're as healthy as can be, And I lived in this rural area, and people would say they're healthy as a horse. They're these dairy farmers, don't even take a day off, but, they just apply themselves, do their job. And here they are lying on a litter with up to half their body paralyzed. And so I have to admit that I really struggled with that, because where I certainly found that many people can feel very helpless and very hopeless, which is very difficult, is admitting my own helplessness and hopelessness and trying to help you. How do you just deal with someone who, again, one day healthy as can be, and the next day not in control of their life at all? So the good news for me was that I started to think out of the box as such. Trained scientifically, you have to rely on other research to try to explain things. Well, in this case, I started to look into more spiritual approaches of trying to understand suffering. And that's when I've shared with you before that one of the great discoveries was, although I already knew this, it was just an interesting confirmation, is religions pretty much disagree on everything. I mean, even if you just think about it, the idea is, why are there so many different religions? Good. So what occurred to me, though, in that search was that I discovered that religions actually managed to agree on two major points. That really surprised me. How in the world, with all of their differences, God bless them with great respect, how did they manage to agree on two? And the one that was absolutely the most absurd was the one they absolutely agreed on. We are God. I joke, I've done this before, but I can't help but thinking about it again. In psychology, we have psychiatric diagnoses for people who think they're God. So again, forgive me, and partly with a sense of humor to try to make some points here, but the wisdom, as you've already introduced in different ways today, is, guess what? It really does appear to be the truth. And I'll build on that with a couple things I actually want to read to you today that make a lot of sense for me and maybe will help me support this point as well as for you. So I wrote down here some of the other questions that came up for me in this trying to make sense of suffering in particular. And I remember, and I've shared this before too, but having to tell my patients so often, it's just trying to be truthful with them and try to make sense of suffering and why sometimes you don't just get well. I got to the point where I was just glad if you could be discharged to home instead of a nursing home. And so I found myself saying, honest to goodness, sometimes life stinks. And I think there's a wisdom in being open and honest about it, that there are difficult times. And in different ways you've said today how we can address this, like with a sense of community, with a sense of a place like this where you can come to, where people like, Jesse and Catherine and others, you can come and talk about your concerns. And maybe one of the biggest questions I found then that was raised, and perhaps you've thought of this too, is why me? And not maybe just because, why me? Because you're the one who's sick as such. How about the idea of like survivor's guilt? I just watched a movie recently that brought that up. How was I spared? Why was I spared? And why was this person not? Is suffering a form of spiritual punishment? Again, over all the years, I've been around a while, and conversations I've been involved in, and then when my life took a more spiritual path in trying to understand what really heals. So these questions were not unusual. Did you ever say to yourself or hear someone say, God could never give me more than I could handle? Right. Again, I mean that well. I'm trying to be honest with you about there are some really difficult times in life, and there aren't easy answers, in my opinion, and in my experience. Is God vengeful? The Bible's full of that one. But one of the things that helped me the most, I was actually at Carolyn Mace workshop one weekend, And there was a priest who was part of the presentation. So I thought, I'm going to go ask this person if he's in some way allied with Carolyn, and he is a priest. I'll be real curious his perspective. So I asked him, so why suffering? And his answer to me was, do you believe God could ever intend harm? That registered with me. But what another good question, I believe, that you may want to ask as you look at your life in the difficult times. Because it's really easy, in my experience, for you to begin to question your faith or your spirituality. And that's where I would remind you or say to you, be gentle with yourself in that process. Remember again, who has all the answers? Who knows for sure? So I want to read you one passage that helped me early in my career. Do any of you recognize the name Joan Borisenko? Oh, good. Okay. Well, I really do. Her book, Guilt is a Teacher, Love is the Lesson, one of my favorite all-time books. Anyhow, this book is Minding the Body and Mending the Mind. So a quote, Shakespeare said, when the sea was calm, all boats alike showed mastership in floating. Only in a storm are they obliged to cope. Storms and struggles, chaos and tragedy have always been looked upon as the teachers of valuable, if unwelcome, lessons. In the struggle to survive a stressful situation, a new way of being often emerges that is much more satisfying than the old. Every religion and the great myths and fables of all cultures discuss change and growth through the archetypes of death and rebirth. Easter and Passover, symbolic of death and resurrection, are also metaphors for escape from our past conditioning and outmoded concepts, and rebirth into freedom. The phoenix that arises from its ashes and the seed that dies to give birth to the flower are all variations on the theme of life as a continuous process of growth. So in reading that to you and then thinking as I'm preparing my questions about mystery, so does life serve a purpose? An honest question. I know a lot of people, including myself, until my life turned around so dramatically, it was one time around on the merry-go-round, make the best of it. And that's not a bad philosophy if you think about it. What is the purpose? And so I thought about learning to love, which I certainly talked about in my book, Why Love Heals. Is it about developing compassion? And so if you don't mind, I want to read you something else that made a lot of sense to me in trying to come to terms with the idea of our godness and the idea that we are one. And I will also tip my hand here a little bit. In this process, I discovered that today is literally the first Sunday of Advent. So I'll lead into that, which will then lead into our meditation as well. So this is from Conversations with God, Book 3. And at any time later, if you're interested, I would be very pleased to hear your feedback about the sense this made to me in trying to understand the bigness of the idea we are God. The soul is everywhere, in, through, and around you. It is that which contains you. It is not carried within the body, but carries the body within it. The soul is that which holds you together, just as the soul of God is that which contains the universe and holds it together. But if the soul is, in a sense, the air in and around us, and if everyone else's soul is the same, where does one soul end and another begin? There is no place where another soul ends and ours begins, just like there is no place where the air in the living room stops and the air in the dining room starts. It's all the same air. It's all the same soul. This is the secret of the universe. If God is that which contains the universe, just as we are that which contains our bodies, then there is no place where God ends and we begin. All of life is vibration. That which you call life, you could just as easily call God. It's pure energy. That energy is vibrating constantly, always. It is moving in waves. The waves vibrate at different speeds, producing different degrees of density or light. This, in turn, produces what you would call different effects in the physical world, actually different physical objects. Yet while the objects are different and discrete, the energy which produces them is exactly the same. Let me go back to the example used in the air between your living room and dining room. There was no specific place between those two physical locations where the air of the living room stopped and the air of the dining room began. Yet there is a place where the air of the living room becomes less dense. That it dissipates, becomes thinner. So too the air of the dining room. The further from the dining room you go, the less you smell dinner. Now the air in the house is still the same air. Do you understand? It just seems separate. So let me shorten this because there's more to it that I would like to read, but I don't want to just get too crazy here. So I've just emphasized the idea of the same air. So the soul is everywhere, God is everywhere. That which God is could not experience itself as what it is until it developed this ability to differentiate. So that which is all separated into that which is this and that which is that. I'm trying to make this simple. The clumps of energy which coalesced into discrete units that held in physical beings are what you have chosen to call souls. The parts of me that have become the lot of you are what we are talking about here. Thus, the divine dichotomy. There is only one of us. There are many of us. Okay, so thank you for your willingness to let me share that with you somewhat extensively. And so now, as I told you, I wanted to lead into my discovery that this is the first Sunday of Advent. And I'm going to admit to you, I want to say I didn't know what Advent was, so of course I looked it up. Advent is a season observed in most Christian denominations as a time of expectant waiting and preparation for both the celebration of the Nativity of Christ at Christmas and the return of Christ at the second coming. And so in reading much more about this, and no surprise, there were lots of different explanations and understandings for the idea of Advent, and certainly including the idea of a literal second coming. But what I propose, and was proposed in a number of discussions of Advent, and one of the things that actually surprised me, which is a little lighter for a moment, so practices associated with Advent include Advent calendars and so forth, but also the erecting of a Christmas tree and setting up Christmas decorations. Did anyone know that? These are actually parts of the preparation for Advent. Anyhow, I thought, well, that's cool. Now, in another explanation, though, and this is what I want to do to help you support this idea of the mystery of our oneness, but also then lead into our meditation today. So there is a discussion between the cosmic Christ, or Christ without, and the Christ within. According to this tradition, the Christ within is regarded as the true Savior who needs to be born within each individual in order to evolve into new heavens and a new earth. And this is why I brought this book in particular, because I'm sure some of you are very familiar with Eckhart Tolle, and of all things, his book is literally titled A New Earth. And for what it's worth, it's about how to awaken to a new state of consciousness and follow the path to a truly fulfilling existence. So one more, and I know I'll mispronounce this, so with great respect. In modern times, some traditional Indian religions and leaders have moved to embrace Jesus as an avatar or incarnation of God. In light of this, the Indian guru Paramahansa Yogananda, so God forgive me for mispronouncing that, author of Autobiography of a Yogi, wrote an extensive commentary on the Gospels, published in 2004 as a 2-volume set, literally titled The Second Coming of Christ, the Resurrection of the Christ Within You. The book offers a mystical interpretation of the second coming, in which it is understood to be an inner experience, something that takes place within the individual heart. In the introduction of this book, Yogananda wrote that the true second coming is the resurrection within you of the infinite Christ consciousness. Also stated in the book of Luke, neither shall they say, lo here or lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. And so now I would like to make this transition into our guided meditation. Thank you, Coach. So if you will, please make yourself as comfortable as you can where you're sitting. And then if you will, please close your eyes to help you focus. We are all the same soul. There is only one of us. Let us now celebrate this first Sunday in Advent by going within and resurrecting the Christ within us. Please now open your heart and soul to the Christ within. Please take your time. Thank you very much.